May 3rd, 1945, the final days of World War II in Europe. In the cold waters of Lübeck Bay, off the northern coast of Germany, a magnificent ship burns. The SS Cap Arcona, once known as the Queen of the South Atlantic, is engulfed in flames. Thousands of people are trapped below decks, screaming for help that will never come. But this is no ordinary tragedy. The Cap Arcona wasn't sunk by German U-boats or mines. It was destroyed by British Royal Air Force pilots who believed they were attacking ships carrying fleeing Nazi officers attempting to escape to Norway. The pilots had no idea they were killing concentration camp survivors. This is the story of how a luxury ocean liner became a floating concentration camp, and how one of history's worst maritime disasters remained hidden for decades, buried in classified documents not to be opened until the year 2045. Our story begins not in 1945, but in the late 1920s, in a Germany that was on its knees. The First World War had left the country economically devastated. Hyperinflation gripped the nation. The Treaty of Versailles demanded crushing reparations. Germany had been demilitarized, deindustrialized, and utterly humiliated on the world stage. The story of Germany in the 1920s is one of a nation trying to recover from both the physical and psychological wounds of defeat. It's a country on its knees, emasculated, feeling deeply sorry for itself. The reparations demanded by the Allies were crushing the economy. Hyperinflation had made the German mark virtually worthless. People were carrying wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread. It was a country in crisis, but amid this economic ruin and national humiliation, one aggressive and well-managed company refused to surrender to despair. Blohm & Voss, one of the world's greatest shipbuilders, still in business today, partnered with Hamburg Süd, one of the greatest ship operators, also still in business today. Together, they launched an audacious idea. They were going to build the greatest ship afloat as a way of getting Germany back into the maritime business, but also for purposes of national pride. This was more than a commercial venture. It was a statement to the world that Germany was not finished, that German engineering and craftsmanship could still produce something magnificent. Inspired by the Titanic, no expense would be spared in the creation of this magnificent cruise ship. When you hear about the scale of both the cost and the facilities on board the Cap Arcona, it's mind-boggling. 35 billion Reichsmarks to build. The luxury was off the scale. The ship featured a full-size tennis court on the upper deck, an indoor ballroom with crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The first-class apartments had silk upholstery on the furniture and full-length marble baths. Almost no effort had been spared in creating this unbelievably luxurious vessel. It was an absolute magnificent luxury ship, very much in keeping with the spirit of the 1920s, which was about enjoying oneself, the rise of consumerism and luxury, and leaving behind the horrors of the Great War. The SS Cap Arcona was laid down on July 21, 1926, at Blohm & Voss shipyards in Hamburg as yard number 476. On May 14, 1927, she was launched. The specifications were impressive: 27,561 gross register tons, 205.9 meters in overall length, with a beam of 25.78 meters. She had 3 distinctive funnels, 8 steam turbines providing tremendous power, modern navigational and communication equipment, and was even equipped with submarine signaling technology that allowed the ship to hear acoustic signals from navigational aids. In 1934, she would be fitted with an echo-sounding device, making her one of the most technologically advanced ships of her era. The Cap Arcona entered service on October 29, 1927, commencing her maiden voyage from Hamburg to Buenos Aires. She joined Hamburg Süd's flagship, the Cap Polonio, on the South Atlantic route. From the very beginning, the ship was a sensation. Hollywood film stars boarded her. Members of European royalty sought passage. Captains of industry booked first-class cabins for the 3-week journey to South America. They were all flocking to this ship, and this ship represented the technological rebirth of Germany after the First World War. It was a symbol that Germany could still produce world-class engineering and craftsmanship. For 8 glorious years, the Cap Arcona represented everything Germany wanted to be: sophisticated, powerful, respected, and back on the world stage. The ship quickly became known as the Queen of the South Atlantic, dominating the route between Europe and South America. The opulence enjoyed on board hadn't been seen for quite some time. This incredibly sophisticated, luxurious vessel was drawing people from all walks of life. but particularly people with money and influence. It was the sort of rise before the fall, the pride before the fall in many respects, because decadence, frivolity, and pleasure would not remain the focus of German politics for much longer. The ship's record wasn't perfect. On October 6, 1932, she collided with the French ship Ain in the North Sea, off the Elbe. The Ain was beached but later refloated and escorted to Hamburg. These incidents were relatively minor, and the Cap Arcona continued her service as one of the premier luxury liners on the Atlantic. However, the story of the Cap Arcona as a luxury liner would be tragically short-lived. About 8 years from the day she was launched, her role would change dramatically. But how and why she would ultimately be destroyed would remain a mystery for decades to come. The story of Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s becomes increasingly dark. In 1929, the stock market crashed in the United States, and the resulting Great Depression affected the entire world. The tragedy for Germany was that this economic disaster hit just as the country seemed to be recovering from the First World War. So you had this small economic resurgence which seemed to be gathering pace, and then it was stopped in its tracks. Germany was as affected by the Depression as everyone else, perhaps even more so because of its already fragile economy. You got a real sense of not only economic hardship, but also deep political grievance. The combination of these two factors would explain the rise of a party that promised to make Germany great again. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, ostensibly to assist with the economic stabilization of the country, but he quickly began implementing racist and fascist policies in order to seize total control. Germany's days as a peaceful nation were over. The Nazis were coming to power. Hitler was very good at blame-mongering, at scapegoating, at playing the US versus them card. He demonized all those whom he deemed as others in Germany, claiming they were responsible for the economic turmoil. So the German people channeled their frustration toward these scapegoats. In this respect, the Nazis proved they had raw talent for manipulation, for commanding the masses, for puppeteering great swathes of the population. How did the most educated country in Europe end up voting for National Socialism and Hitler as Chancellor? Propaganda campaigns led by Joseph Goebbels, heralding Aryan superiority, swept through Germany. A two-tiered society was created between Aryans and those deemed inferior. Gradually, the Nazi regime began building concentration camps to imprison these groups of people, as well as any political opponents. Blatantly defying the Treaty of Versailles signed after World War I, Hitler began rapidly rebuilding and rearming the German military. As a result of these developments, the world's rich and famous began turning their backs on the Cap Arcona. The ship's popularity diminished precipitously once the Nazis came to power. Far from being a symbol of a resurgent nation that people wanted to be associated with, it now became a symbol of Nazism. The opulent cruise liner that had represented German Renaissance was now tainted by association with a regime that the rest of the world was growing increasingly wary of. On August 24, 1939, having lost all appeal as a tourist destination under the Nazi regime, the Cap Arcona made what would be her final commercial voyage. She departed South America, but this time she carried only 2 passengers, making the return trip back to Germany. It was a stark contrast to the ship's glory days, when every cabin was full and there was a waiting list for passage. The very next day, August 25th, another German ship arrived in the Polish port of Danzig, the Schleswig-Holstein, a battleship, ostensibly on a goodwill visit. The interesting thing about German sea power at this moment was what happened with the cruiser Schleswig-Holstein. It was sent to Danzig, which was a free port in the Polish corridor, a strip of land that had been taken from Germany at the end of the First World War and given to Poland. Unbeknownst to the greeting crowd of civilians who came to see the impressive warship, the Schleswig-Holstein was carrying 300 heavily armed German assault troops below deck, preparing to initiate an attack that would result in a global conflict. In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, the Schleswig-Holstein slipped out of her moorings and glided downstream to anchor with a clear view of the Polish garrison on the Westerplatte Peninsula. At 4:47 a.m., the hidden assault troops emerged and unleashed their weapons on the garrison, commencing the German invasion of Poland. Hitler invaded Poland with his Blitzkrieg operation, and everything changed. The Polish cities of Warsaw and Krakow were bombed, and the port city of Danzig, which was a strategic location in the Baltics, was quickly annexed. The Nazis refused to withdraw their troops, and 2 days later, on September 3rd, France and Britain declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Meanwhile, the Cap Arcona was sailing back to Germany just days before the war broke out. The captain received a communication: make immediate plans to get back to port. You've got to understand that ultimately what tends to happen in any nation during wartime is that a lot of civilian shipping will be requisitioned by the government. It happened in Britain, it happened in America during the Second World War, all to assist with the war effort. The Cap Arcona was a sizable vessel, and Germany was at war. They needed to train and house their navy, and the ship was an obvious stopgap solution. The Cap Arcona made her way to the port of Gotenhafen, which is now Gdynia in modern-day Poland. On arrival, the magnificent ship was painted military grey, and her fine furnishings were systematically removed. The silk upholstery, the crystal chandeliers, the marble fixtures, all the opulence that had made her famous was stripped away. The ship was being transformed into a barracks for German sailors, a floating training facility for the Kriegsmarine. It was a far cry from her days of hosting royalty and celebrities on board. The Cap Arcona, symbol of German luxury and sophistication, had become a utilitarian military vessel. Although the ship had been transformed, her former opulence would not be forgotten. In particular, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, would remember the Cap Arcona and find a use for her that would be both ambitious and ultimately disastrous. In 1940, the Nazis attempted to invade Britain with Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain, trying to bomb the British into submission. The initial strategy by the Germans made a lot of sense. Target communication centers and airfields, basically knocking out the enemy air force. But when they didn't have initial success from July onwards, the Germans decided to switch tactics and target London, almost as though they were going to bomb Britain into submission. Squadron after squadron flew across the English Channel to bomb Britain, and in one of history's greatest upsets, a few RAF pilots defeated the Luftwaffe. It was one of the first major German defeats. They failed to achieve air superiority, and the Blitz in many ways can be read as a desperate act. With the Nazis unable to defeat the British militarily, Joseph Goebbels wanted to launch another kind of attack to weaken British resolve: a propaganda attack. Goebbels was frustrated and outraged that Britain was still fighting. He decided to create a propaganda tool that was going to take the wind out of Britain's sails, as he perceived it. Goebbels did several things for Hitler. He was a captivating speaker, fanatically loyal and devoted. But one of the most important things he did was make movies. Joseph Goebbels produced or was part of hundreds of films during the Nazi era. The recognition that film was a powerful medium was understood by the Nazis, particularly by Goebbels, very early on. The British Navy had been one of the most powerful in the world for hundreds of years. Hitler and Goebbels not only wanted to defeat Britain, they wanted to embarrass Britain, and first and foremost, they wanted to embarrass the Royal Navy. And what better way to do this than to point out that Britain's Titanic had sunk while Germany's Titanic, the Cap Arcona, was still afloat. In April 1912, on its maiden voyage, the Titanic, a luxurious passenger liner with such advanced engineering it was deemed unsinkable, headed across the Atlantic from Southampton to New York with 2,240 passengers and crew on board. But just 4 days into its journey, it struck an iceberg and sank. The press throughout the UK had been promoting it as a symbol of British ingenuity and British strength. So, when the Titanic went down after hitting the iceberg, taking roughly 1,500 souls down with her, it became one of history's deadliest maritime disasters at the time. Recognizing that the Titanic disaster was a delicate moment in British history, Goebbels planned to use this tragedy as the centerpiece for his propaganda campaign to demoralize the British people. Hitler and Goebbels were fascinated with movies. They loved Hollywood films and watched them all the time. It was not uncommon for them to watch 2 or 3 back-to-back with translators and interpreters. Goebbels decided that the best way to get back at British morale was to make a film about the sinking of the Titanic. He came up with the idea to make a film about the Titanic in order to portray the British Navy as incompetent, ruthless, and stupid, with the grand design that the German people would believe it and therefore want to support an attack against the United Kingdom. In early 1942, filming of this Nazi Titanic propaganda film finally began at Berlin's high-end Tobis Studios. Goebbels secured a budget of 4 million Reichsmarks, the largest film budget in the world at that time. He had gotten the green light from Hitler himself, which put enormous pressure on Goebbels to deliver. They reassigned entire military units to serve as extras, providing the cast of thousands. They found the most beautiful German models, the most handsome matinee idols, the best set builders and carpenters. They spared absolutely no expense. Goebbels hired German director Herbert Selpin to bring his vision to life. Selpin was the best-known German film director of the era. He wasn't particularly pro-Nazi, but he was very anti-British, so he was the right person for this type of job. He was also at the top of his game and specialized in action, drama, romance hybrids, just like the Hollywood blockbusters such as Casablanca. He brought on his childhood friend, Walter Zerlett-Olfenius, who had been a screenwriter in Germany since 1936 and was a Nazi ideologue who understood what Hitler and ultimately what Goebbels wanted. Hitler's interest in the film put more pressure on Goebbels than on Selpin because of the great personal admiration that Goebbels had for Hitler. Goebbels didn't want a typical heavy-handed propaganda film. He wanted an action, drama, romance hybrid just like the Hollywood blockbusters, and that's what Selpin specialized in. Selpin had an offer that was too good for him to refuse, a huge budget, huge support, the starting point for what was envisioned as a new German Hollywood. In essence, he probably thought he would be a big player in that new Hollywood for years and years to come. Meanwhile, Goebbels' Titanic propaganda project was going terribly. Director Selpin's Hollywood-style demanding behavior reached new levels. He insisted on using an actual ship from the German Navy to be the centerpiece of action in the film. You've got all these creative nightmares, giant egos, and ridiculous amounts of cash despite rationing and restrictions everywhere else in Germany. And they couldn't get the crucial sinking of the ship scene that was needed to make the movie the blockbuster that Goebbels and Selpin wanted. To create a film about the Titanic, you had to have a scene with an iceberg. That was absolutely necessary. Selpin obviously wanted it to be grand, to look as good as possible, because that had been his motivation throughout the entire filming process. The movie was running over budget and behind schedule, and Hitler wanted his movie, so he was breathing down Goebbels' neck. Goebbels wanted his movie, so he was breathing down Selpin's neck. To satisfy Selpin's latest demands, Goebbels leaned on the Kriegsmarine to present several different ship options to use in the film. If they were going to make a film about the Titanic, they had a near replica of the Titanic sitting on the Polish coast. What better ship to use than the one that was in effect the Titanic of the 1920s and 1930s, the Cap Arcona? They could paint it, restore it to the point where people would look at it and say, that's the Titanic. This incredibly sophisticated, luxurious vessel, even though it had been stripped down for military use, still had the right profile, the right proportions, the right visual impact. Having secured the Cap Arcona, Selpin relocated the entire cast and crew to the southern Baltic coast for filming. Goebbels arranged for German naval officers to be used as extras for the film. Filming was scheduled to resume on April 29, 1942, but it didn't go as planned. Basically, anything that could go wrong went wrong. The weather didn't cooperate. One of the lead actresses got pregnant from one of the soldiers or sailors on set. The sailors and soldiers on set were getting drunk and wrecking the set. People were having too much fun not serving in the war, and therefore they didn't memorize their lines. Everything was going wrong. All of this was grating on the perfectionist Herbert Selpin's nerves. Selpin was a person who was supposed to be in control, and he was being given situations and circumstances that were out of his control, especially when military personnel and naval officers were put on the ship as extras. Stress was building and building until he reached a breaking point. What made matters worse is that he talked about it, and that's where the director made a fatal mistake. He assumed that somehow he was above the regular nightmare that was Nazi oppression, and so he spoke rather freely about the problems with the production. Ultimately, his complaints spoke ill of the boss, who was Goebbels, and there was no freedom of thought in Nazi Germany. After Selpin's meltdown on the set of the Cap Arcona, his childhood friend Walter Zerlett-Olfenius resigned from working on the film. A loyal Nazi, Zerlett-Olfenius boarded a train to Berlin and reported Selpin's behavior to the Gestapo, sealing the fate of his former childhood friend. Nazi Germany was all built on absolute, unquestioning devotion. People were encouraged to report on their neighbors if somebody wasn't completely devoted to the regime. The Gestapo was everywhere, and when Herbert Selpin went off about the Nazi party, he was summoned to Berlin. When Selpin was brought in to discuss his outburst, he was unrepentant. He may not have thought that it was as serious as it actually was, and that would prove to be an error in judgment on his part. He would pay the ultimate price for it in the end. Unapologetic about his disparaging remarks regarding the Nazi regime, Selpin was handed over to the Gestapo and charged with treason and disloyalty. Around midnight on July 31st, 1942, German guards visited Selpin's cell at Gestapo headquarters. They found him hanged, allegedly by his own suspenders. Whether it was suicide or murder disguised as suicide has never been conclusively determined, but the result was the same. The director of the Nazi Titanic was dead, and the film was in jeopardy. With Selpin dead, Joseph Goebbels' epic propaganda film was in serious trouble. Not surprisingly, no other prominent directors wanted to finish the film. They had all seen what happened to Selpin, and they understood the dangers of being associated with a troubled, high-profile Nazi propaganda project. Eventually, they found a B-list director named Werner Klingler, who agreed to come in and finish the project. It was presented with great fanfare to Goebbels, who watched it in a private viewing room. And slowly it dawned on him the full irony of what he had done. He had created, in the middle of what was becoming an increasingly desperate war that Germany was no longer winning, a metaphor for Germany and its war effort. He had made a film about a bunch of people heading toward disaster, led by an unthinking, foolish leader. This was Germany. Goebbels realized that he had gotten the balance wrong. He had gone in too heavy with his anti-British narrative. He thought that this film would work perfectly as propaganda, but much to his shock and horror, it was a terrible film, and he realized that there was absolutely nothing that could be spun out of this disaster. Having the Kriegsmarine be in the position it was in when the film was completed, and having so many individuals having been killed on the water in recent naval battles, it was difficult to imagine that the German public would have responded well to this type of film. After seeing this sinking ship movie that was meant to be the crown jewel to launch a Nazi Hollywood, Goebbels made the decision to ban the film in Germany. After such high expectations, after investing so much money, effort, and time, after a director had died during production, the film was not even shown to the German public. It did not accomplish its purpose of changing the complexion of the war or demoralizing the British. The Nazi Titanic was a complete failure. After this debacle, the Cap Arcona returned to its previous wartime use as a training base and floating barracks for the Kriegsmarine. The ship that had been Germany's pride in the 1920s and 1930s was now just another military vessel, rusting in port, stripped of its glory, serving a utilitarian purpose for a regime that was beginning to realize it was losing the war. By 1944, Nazi Germany was clearly losing the war on all fronts. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. D-Day was very much the signature day of the Allied war effort, an absolutely crucial, pivotal moment in Second World War history. It was the beginning of the end of the Nazi reign. The Allies were getting a toehold on the European continent, and D-Day proved to be an overwhelming success. But it wasn't just in the West that Germany was facing defeat. In the East, the situation was even more dire. In June 1941, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest and most ambitious military actions in world history. Hitler sent multiple divisions into the Soviet Union in what would prove to be the turning point of the war. This large-scale surprise assault consisted of over 3 million German soldiers who initially overwhelmed the Russian army. You can see from the launch of Operation Barbarossa that while military troops were at the front, at the tip of the spear, following very close behind, were murderous squads of Einsatzgruppen. Clearly, the policy was dual-edged from the start. Defeat the Russian enemy militarily, but while defeating them, kill off anyone considered to be undesirable. This was hell on earth. Even in the hellish nature of World War II globally, this was a real epicenter of horror. Despite their initial success, the Nazis were unable to dominate Russia as quickly as they had planned, and they were severely unprepared for the harsh winter conditions that awaited them. The writing was really on the wall when they were turned back from Moscow in terrible winter conditions in December 1941. The Red Army launched a massive counterattack against the Nazis, driving them back from Moscow in utter chaos. The Russians counterattacked, and the Germans were pushed all the way back to a line from which, although they would advance from a little bit, they would never get back to Moscow. As the war progressed and Germany found itself losing ground, the front with Russia turned into a very hard front that the Germans were now retreating from. They had a huge morale problem. By 1944, 3 years after the German invasion of Russia, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration. 2 million Red Army soldiers counterattacked and began systematically pushing the Germans out of Russia. As payback to the Nazis for their savagery toward Russian soldiers and citizens, the Red Army soldiers were ruthless in their advance. The Nazis would ultimately get a taste of their own medicine for what they had done to the Russians. The Red Army was leaving behind a trail of murder and destruction. Even though Stalin had ordered them to race to Berlin, they were literally attacking and killing men, women, children, and the elderly, burning the land, killing farm animals. A swath of destruction was headed toward Berlin, and German civilians knew it was coming. As the Russians came through Eastern Europe, civilians who knew or had heard about what had happened elsewhere desperately wanted to get out. They understood that the Red Army was seeking revenge for the atrocities committed by German forces during the invasion of Russia. To keep Reich citizens out of Russian hands, in January 1945, the Nazis launched Operation Hannibal. This operation has been called by some historians the greatest evacuation operation in history, surpassing even Dunkirk in scale. Thousands and thousands of Germans, soldiers, wounded personnel, civilians, ethnic Germans living in Eastern Europe were all racing to the Baltic Sea to try to be evacuated before the Red Army arrived. You get this extraordinary evacuation of troops, personnel, civilians, and prisoners. It's like the Great Shift westward. There were definitely a lot of discussions in senior Nazi circles, in the SS and in the party itself, that they would create a last stand, and in many ways you get the feeling that this was done to please Hitler. In Goebbels's and Hitler's minds, there were still people who cared and who would fight to the end. While there were some fanatics, the vast majority of Germans had accepted the reality that they were doomed. Nevertheless, there was a rumor at the end of the war that the Nazis were going to flee to Norway to make one final stand, a final redoubt where the most fanatical Nazis would make their last desperate resistance. After years of sitting in the port of Gotenhafen as a floating barracks and movie set, the rusted-out Cap Arcona was refitted to take on a more active role in Operation Hannibal. The interior was stripped even further to make room for German refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army. Even though the ship was in serious disrepair and was rusting, it was necessary to bring her into Operation Hannibal because the Germans needed all hands on deck. Every available vessel was being pressed into service. The Cap Arcona wasn't really, from all accounts, a seaworthy vessel at that point, but the fact that they needed to use her, or they felt they needed to use her, speaks to the dire straits that they were in. They didn't have better options available. This was an incredibly dangerous undertaking because the Baltic at this point, with the advance of the Russian armies, meant that Russian submarines in particular posed a serious threat. Earlier in Operation Hannibal, a single ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, was sunk by a Soviet submarine on January 30th, 1945, and approximately 9,400 people went down with it. Another ship, the General von Steuben, was sunk with over 4,000 lives lost. So at any moment during these evacuations, ships could be sunk with the loss of huge numbers of German civilians and military personnel. Despite these dangers, the Cap Arcona successfully completed several missions transporting German refugees from Poland to Denmark. Ultimately, it was the Cap Arcona's sophisticated design that allowed it to cross the Baltic and survive these dangerous voyages. The ship was fast, well-built, and her hulls were reinforced. So the Cap Arcona's design, built back in 1927, was by 1945 still ahead of its time in many ways. Her speed allowed her to outrun Soviet submarines that might have otherwise torpedoed her. On February 20th, 1945, while the ship was docked in Copenhagen, Captain Johannes Gertz shot himself in his cabin rather than face the prospect of returning to Gotenhafen. The stress of operating an aging vessel in dangerous waters, combined with the knowledge of Germany's impending defeat, had proven too much for him. By the end of March 1945, the Cap Arcona finished her third and final evacuation trip between Gotenhafen and Copenhagen, carrying approximately 9,000 soldiers and refugees. But her turbines were worn out and could only be partially repaired. She was officially decommissioned from Operation Hannibal and ordered out of Copenhagen harbor in April. But while the Cap Arcona was being relocated, events were unfolding that would seal her fate and the fate of thousands of people. With the Red Army taking over Poland by April 1945, the Cap Arcona could no longer safely remain in Polish ports. She had been the subject of the propaganda film about the Titanic. She had been Hitler's beloved ship, the so-called Nazi Titanic. She had to flee, or the Soviet army would likely have sunk her. The ship was relocated to Germany, to Lübeck Bay, near the small town of Neustadt on the northern coast. It's ironic, and probably just coincidental, that the Cap Arcona was sent to Lübeck Bay at the same time that Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, gave an order that would have catastrophic consequences. Himmler ordered that all the concentration camps were to be liquidated and that no living inmate was to fall into Allied hands. That didn't necessarily mean the prisoners were all to be executed immediately, but some camp commandants and senior SS officials interpreted it that way or saw an opportunity to commit one final atrocity. Some commandants decided to evacuate their camps and force march their prisoners toward the Baltic Sea. These became known as the death marches, and they were horrific beyond description. Prisoners who had survived years in concentration camps, who were already malnourished and weakened, were forced to march hundreds of kilometers in the dead of winter. Those who couldn't keep up were shot. Those who fell were left to die. Survivors described tripping over the bodies that had fallen in front of them if they were toward the back of the column. There were long, snaking trails of death leading to the Baltic coast. The destination of these death marches was Lübeck Bay, and unbeknownst to the prisoners stumbling forward in their weakened, dying state, they were marching toward the Cap Arcona. On April 17, 1945, thousands of Death March survivors arrived at Lübeck Bay. Those who were still able to walk were loaded onto barges and ferried out to anchored ships in the bay. There were 4 main vessels assembled there, the Cap Arcona and the Deutschland, both former luxury ocean liners, and 2 freighters, the Thielbeck and the Athyn. The living conditions being created on board these ships were inhumane in the extreme. There was no food provided, no water, and medical attention would be completely denied. Prisoners and Soviet prisoners of war were locked below decks in the cargo holds. On April 30, 1945, the day Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin, 2 Swedish ships that had been employed as support vessels for humanitarian operations made a final rescue trip to Lübeck Bay. The Swedish Red Cross managed to evacuate some Scandinavian prisoners who were considered less threatening to Germany under Heinrich Himmler's agreement. But by early May, any plans for further relocations had been dashed by the rapid British military advance toward the Baltic coast. The SS leadership, which had moved to Flensburg near the Danish border, discussed scuttling the ships with the captive prisoners still on board. On May 2, 1945, more prisoners from the Stutthof and Mittelbau-Dora concentration camps were loaded onto barges and brought out to the anchored vessels. The Cap Arcona refused to accept any more prisoners because she was already dangerously overcrowded with over 5,000 people packed into her holds. About 800 prisoners were returned to the beach at Neustadt. That same morning, on May 3rd, approximately 500 of these returned prisoners were killed in their barges by machine gun fire or beaten to death by SS guards. The SS were seeking to make their escape, unencumbered by what they viewed as excess baggage, human beings they considered disposable. At the same time, on May 3rd, the British Second Army discovered the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg completely empty. They reached the coastal towns of Lübeck and Wismar without any resistance. Lübeck had a permanent International Red Cross function, and Mr. Arnaud Dubois of the International Committee of the Red Cross informed British 11th Armoured Division Commander Major General Philip Roberts that between 7,000 and 8,000 prisoners were aboard ships offshore in Lübeck Bay. This was crucial information that should have immediately halted any planned airstrikes on the vessels. Meanwhile, British intelligence had been tracking the movements of the remaining Nazi leadership. They knew that high-ranking Nazi officials, including Heinrich Himmler and various SS commanders and concentration camp commandants, were in Flensburg. Through ultra-interception of German communications, the British had learned that these officials were planning to escape, possibly to Norway. where there were rumors of a Nazi redoubt being prepared for a final stand. Western Allied intelligence had intercepted orders from Hitler's successor, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, that the SS leadership were to be facilitated in escaping Allied capture, or otherwise issued with false Kriegsmarine naval uniforms to avoid capture and prosecution. Dönitz claimed to maintain the lie that his administration had been free from involvement in concentration camps or the mass genocide, even though this was patently false. The British believed that the large ships congregating in Lübeck Bay, including the Cap Arcona, the Deutschland, and the Tilbeck, were being prepared to transport these Nazi war criminals to Norway. None of the ships were painted with Red Cross markings. The Deutschland had a single Red Cross marking on one side of one funnel, but it was barely visible and easily missed from the air. The Cap Arcona and Tilbeck had no markings whatsoever, making them legitimate military targets under the laws of war. On the afternoon of May 3, 1945, the British 5th Reconnaissance Regiment advanced northward to Neustadt. They witnessed ships burning offshore in the bay and began rescuing some prisoners who had managed to reach the beach. But they also found mostly women and children who had died that morning, their bodies staining the sand crimson red. 3 days after Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler had taken his own life in Berlin, and 1 day before the unconditional surrender of German forces in northwestern Germany to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the Cap Arcona, Tilbeck, and Deutschland were about to be attacked as part of general strikes on shipping in the Baltic Sea. The attacking force consisted of pilots from the Royal Air Force flying Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers from No. 83 Group of the 2nd Tactical Air Force. These were experienced combat pilots who had been conducting strikes against German shipping and ground targets throughout the final months of the war. At 5:30 on the morning of May 3rd, 6 squadrons of Typhoon bombers took off from liberated air bases across Europe. Their target was Lübeck Bay, and their mission was clear: sink any large ships to prevent Nazi officials from escaping to Norway. The weather conditions were terrible: cloudy, rainy, and overcast. Visibility was extremely poor. They couldn't see their targets, so they returned to base to refuel and wait for conditions to improve. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, the weather had improved slightly. It was still cloudy and rainy, but visibility was better. The squadrons took off again and flew toward Lübeck Bay. As they approached the target area, they dropped below the cloud cover. And there, sitting at anchor, was the largest ship any of them had ever seen, the Cap Arcona. She was sitting low in the water, which indicated she was heavily loaded with people and possibly fuel. She was a massive, unmistakable target. The 6 squadrons of RAF Typhoons all focused their attack on the Cap Arcona, with secondary attention to the other ships in the bay. The pilots faced little to no resistance. There was no anti-aircraft fire from the ships, no defensive measures taken, no return fire whatsoever. The ships were essentially defenseless, sitting ducks. The Typhoons unleashed a devastating attack, firing a total of 64 rockets and dropping 15 bombs onto the Cap Arcona and the surrounding ships. The pilots were simply following their orders and executing their mission. They had been briefed that these ships were carrying Nazi war criminals attempting to escape justice. They had no idea that thousands of concentration camp prisoners were locked in the holds below deck. Gaping holes were torn into the Cap Arcona's hull from the explosions. Rockets punched through the deck and exploded inside the ship. Fire erupted across multiple decks simultaneously. The giant funnels, weakened by the explosions and fires, broke off and crashed down onto the deck below, crushing people like bowling balls crushing pins. Below the waterline, freezing Baltic seawater began flooding into the ship through the massive holes torn in her hull. For anyone trapped below deck in the cargo holds where the prisoners were confined, there was no chance of survival. The holds were locked, and the prisoners had no way to escape as water rushed in. Above deck, the scene was one of utter chaos and horror. SS guards, who had been occupying the luxurious upper deck cabins and suites, were the first to abandon ship. They had access to life jackets that had been kept in locked storage compartments, denying them to the prisoners. The guards grabbed these life jackets, jumped overboard, and began swimming toward shore. The prisoners who were locked below deck had no such opportunity. As the ship listed and began to capsize, some prisoners managed to break out of the holds or were freed by other prisoners who had been on the upper decks. But by this time, the ship was already in its death throes. RAF pilot Alan Wise later recalled the scene with haunting honesty. We used our cannon fire at the chaps in the water. We shot them up with 20mm cannons in the water. Horrible thing, but we were told to do it and we did it. That's war. The pilots, still believing they were shooting Nazi war criminals and SS officers, strafed the people in the water with machine gun fire. Many of those people were actually concentration camp survivors who had somehow managed to escape the burning ship. Among the prisoners trapped on the Cap Arcona was a young Polish boy named Borek Jakubowicz. He had survived multiple concentration camps with his brother Joseph. They had survived the brutal death march to the Baltic coast. They had survived days locked in the deep hold of the Cap Arcona with no food or water. When the British bombs struck and a gaping hole was torn into the side of the ship, freezing water came pouring into their section of the hold. Almost everybody around them died immediately, either from the explosion or drowned as the water rushed in. The Jakubowicz brothers, both young and relatively strong despite their malnourishment, managed to tread water in the darkness as bodies floated around them. At the last possible minute, some concentration camp prisoners from the upper decks, who had not been locked below, bravely risked their own lives to try to save others. They went below deck on a ship that was on fire, rolling over, listing severely, and still being bombed. They found the hatches to the holds and opened them. Hands came down from above and pulled survivors up, one at a time. The Jakubowicz brothers were among those pulled from the flooded hold. They emerged onto the upper deck to find a scene of absolute carnage. The ship was burning, tilting severely, with debris everywhere and people screaming. As the Cap Arcona capsized and sank, hundreds of prisoners who managed to get off the ship and swim toward shore faced yet another horror. German SS units and Wehrmacht soldiers were patrolling the beaches of Neustadt, and they were shooting survivors as they came ashore. Hundreds of prisoners who survived the terrible nightmare of the bombing and the sinking were gunned down on the beach. What makes this even more tragic is that the war was literally days away from being over. Germany was defeated, Hitler was dead, the surrender was imminent, yet even in these final moments the killing continued. The Teelbeck suffered a similar fate to the Cap Arcona. Of the approximately 3,000 prisoners on board the Teelbeck, only about 50 survived the attack and the sinking. The Deutschland was also hit during the attack, but remarkably somehow everyone on board that ship survived. The two freighters, the Teelbeck and Athen, were also targeted. The death toll from the attacks was staggering. Of the approximately 5,000 concentration camp prisoners on the Cap Arcona, only about 350 survived. Combined with the casualties from the other ships, the total death toll on May 3, 1945, was approximately 7,000 people. This made it one of the largest single-incident maritime disasters in history, exceeding even the death toll from the Titanic and approaching the death toll from the Wilhelm Gustloff. In the hours and days after the attack, British forces arrived in full strength at Neustadt and Lübeck. General Mills Roberts, commander of the British 6th Commando, and Major Till, who had been ordered to document the aftermath, witnessed the carnage. They saw the burning wrecks of the ships offshore. They saw the bodies on the beaches. They spoke to survivors and began to understand what had actually happened. The realization was devastating. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners, Holocaust survivors who had endured years of torture and deprivation, who had survived against all odds, had been killed by British bombs in the final days of the war. General Mills Roberts, a hardened combat veteran who had seen some of the worst fighting of the war, called it one of the worst things he had ever witnessed in his entire life. For him to be so affected, given everything he had seen during years of combat, speaks to the magnitude of the tragedy. Major Till documented everything: the testimonies of survivors, the bodies on the beach, the burned-out husks of the ships. But then a decision was made at a higher level. These documents needed to be classified. They were sealed as top secret, not to be opened for 100 years, until the year 2045. Why would documents about a military action in World War II need to be sealed for a century? The reasoning, though never explicitly stated in official records, seems clear. After 6 years of the world's bloodiest war, after 60 to 80 million people had died globally, after the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust had been revealed, the public was in no mood for more stories of death and tragedy. People wanted to move forward. They wanted to rebuild. They wanted to heal. Nobody wanted to look back at the war, especially not at tragedies that involved Allied forces accidentally killing concentration camp survivors. On the cusp of victory, the Allied governments needed to deliver their publics an untarnished victory. There was such a desperate scramble to get back into a peaceful world and to curate a better, healthier, happier narrative. The scrutiny that should have been applied to what could and couldn't be revealed was simply not there. The British government determined that this information could jeopardize national security or morale. Better to bury it, to classify it, to lock it away for a century, and hope that by the time it came out, everyone involved would be long dead. The Cap Arcona remained capsized in the shallow waters of Lübeck Bay until 1949. The Soviets, who controlled that part of Germany after the war, eventually brought the wreck to land for salvage operations. The ship was cut up for scrap metal. Today, there is nothing that remains of the SS Cap Arcona. One of the largest, most luxurious ships ever built has completely vanished. The bodies of the victims began washing up on shore in the days, weeks, and months after the sinking. They were collected and buried in mass graves near Neustadt. But the bodies continued to appear for decades. Parts of skeletons, fragments of remains kept washing up on the beaches. The last recorded skeletal remains were collected in 1971, 26 years after the sinking. For 3 decades, the story of the Cap Arcona remained hidden, known only to a few survivors, some military personnel, and government officials who had access to classified files. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, the British government released a small number of classified World War II documents under the National Secrets Act. These documents described a terrible tragedy at sea involving the Cap Arcona, but the information was incomplete and raised more questions than it answered. The full story remained locked away. Then, in 2014, nearly 70 years after the tragedy, a historian researching the final week of World War II in Europe stumbled upon something unexpected. He was looking for stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, as a way of capturing the power of the war's final days by what he described as dumb luck, which is often how discovery works in historical research. He found a letter from Major Till in the British Army archives. The letter essentially said that Till had never seen or experienced anything as horrific as what happened on the Cap Arcona in the final days of the war. The historian had never heard of the Cap Arcona or this incident. When you're doing research and you find something unexpected, most of the time you want to find out more. He kept searching and found a second letter, this one from General Mills Roberts, the commander of the British 6th Commando. This letter referenced attacks against ships in Lübeck Bay, immediately establishing a connection to Major Till's letter. With 2 pieces of evidence, the trail became easier to follow. The historian began asking obvious questions. Why would a British general and a British major consider the destruction of German ships at the end of World War II to be a tragedy? Generals and majors were hardened combat veterans. They had seen terrible things. What could have happened that would affect them so deeply? He contacted major Holocaust museums. He contacted military history museums and World War II museums, asking, what is this unimaginable tragedy that occurred in the final days of the war? Almost everyone said there was no such incident. Some said they had never heard of it. Others said it sounded implausible. He contacted archives in England and Washington. He sent letters to museums. He called prominent historians. He either didn't get answers, or people said they had no information. Some even suggested he must be mistaken about what he had found. But the historian persisted. He searched online, sketching out different scenarios that might have happened based on the little bits that Till and Mills Roberts had mentioned. He was able to come up with some reasonable guesses. It involved ships. It took place in the final days of the war. It was in the Baltic Sea. It was tragic. It was so significant the documents had probably been classified. When you put those breadcrumbs together, it starts to point toward potential explanations. By a stroke of luck, the historian attended a 70th anniversary D-Day commemoration event in Normandy in June 2014. He was on a luxury riverboat giving lectures about the Normandy landing beaches. There he met an Academy Award-winning filmmaker. They struck up a conversation, discovered they had mutual connections, and he mentioned the story he was researching and how frustrated he was that he couldn't get more information. The filmmaker said, "Let me make a phone call. I know some people." The historian was skeptical, but the filmmaker made good on her promise. Shortly thereafter, the historian got the call he had been waiting for. "We found the documents." The British government was making available 700 to 800 pages of classified documents that had been sealed until 2045. Would he like to see them? After he picked himself up off the floor, he got on the next flight to England. When he received the documents, the hard work began. He had hundreds of pages of material haphazardly organized. He spent days organizing it chronologically, then by topic, spreading everything out on the floor, creating piles, drawing connections, marking everything hour by hour and day by day. He organized it by event and by individual. Gradually, the full story emerged. The documents revealed the complete timeline, the Nazi leadership's discussions about scuttling the ships with prisoners aboard, the Swedish Red Cross's warnings to British intelligence about prisoners on the ships, the failure to pass that critical information to RAF commanders and pilots, the attack itself, the aftermath, the decision to classify everything for 100 years. For the first time, 70 years after the event, the full story could be told. The sinking of the SS Cap Arcona is now recognized as one of the worst friendly fire incidents in military history and one of the largest single-incident maritime disasters ever. Sebastian Cox, the chief historian of the Royal Air Force, stated in interviews that the RAF made a mistake. An individual made a very tragic mistake, and we know the consequences. He characterized it as quite probably the worst case of friendly fire in RAF history, attributing it to the fog of war during the incident. The pilots had no idea that concentration camp survivors were on the ships, but questions remain that will probably never be fully answered. Why weren't the ships marked with Red Cross symbols? If the Germans intended to use these ships for evacuation or for prisoner transport under any kind of humanitarian protocol, they should have been marked. The Deutschland had minimal markings. The Cap Arcona and Lübeck had none. Why? Some historians believe the Germans deliberately failed to mark the ships, knowing or hoping that the Allies would attack them and thus complete the Nazis' plan to prevent prisoners from falling into Allied hands without the Germans having to directly execute them all. Testimonies from SS men after the war suggested that there had been discussions about sinking the ships with prisoners aboard. Did they simply let the RAF do their dirty work for them? The pilots who conducted the attack were simply following orders based on the intelligence they had been given. They believed they were attacking ships carrying fleeing Nazi war criminals. They had no way of knowing the truth. When the full story finally emerged decades later, several of the surviving pilots were devastated to learn what had actually happened. They had carried out their orders perfectly, executed their mission flawlessly, and inadvertently caused a catastrophe. The failure to pass the Swedish Red Cross information to the RAF remains one of the most critical mistakes. The Red Cross had informed British intelligence on May 2nd, a full day before the attack, that thousands of concentration camp prisoners were aboard the ships in Lübeck Bay. This information never reached the RAF commanders planning the strike, and it certainly never reached the pilots conducting it. Whether this was due to bureaucratic inefficiency, poor communication systems, or deliberate suppression remains unclear. The classified documents don't provide a definitive answer. The Cap Arcona story is important for multiple reasons. First, it serves as a reminder of the fog of war and how even well-intentioned military actions can result in tragedy when operating with incomplete or incorrect information. Second, it demonstrates the dangers of classifying and burying difficult truths. For decades, this story was hidden, denied, or dismissed. Survivors who tried to tell what happened were often not believed. Third, it shows the importance of persistence in historical research. Without the dedication of historians who refused to give up, who kept asking questions, who followed breadcrumbs wherever they led, this story might have remained buried until 2045 or beyond. The historian who uncovered the story has said that it's probably the most important thing he's ever done professionally. He spent years with the story, from researching it to writing it to working on various projects to share it with the public. And even after all these years, he still has trouble almost believing that any of it's real. It's so surreal, so bizarre and fantastical. But when it comes to Nazi Germany, when it comes to ideas that people like Hitler and Goebbels had, nothing is too bizarre. The regime was capable of unimaginable evil, and the chaos of the war's final days created situations where tragedies could occur that defied comprehension. It's important that history shines a light on all these sorts of stories so that we're honest with ourselves as nations about what we've done in the past and what we're capable of doing. In this case, we're not only supposed to learn from it, but also to remember it and to understand what happened and to strive to do better. The historian who uncovered the story said he hates everything to do with war, but pretending like it doesn't happen and not respecting the lives lost, the sacrifices made, the innocents who were killed, that's even worse. He felt a real heavy sense of responsibility to tell this story. There was no way he wasn't going to pursue it. He would have swum across the Atlantic to unearth whatever documents he could find. He still feels a sense of responsibility even now when discussing it, because it's such a heavy, shocking, and important story. The Cap Arcona began her life as a symbol of hope and German Renaissance in the 1920s. She became a tool of Nazi propaganda in the 1940s, starring in a film about the Titanic that was never shown. She ended her life as a floating concentration camp, destroyed in a tragic case of mistaken identity that killed approximately 7,000 Holocaust survivors in the final days of World War II. Today, nothing physical remains of the ship, but her story survives, preserved now in the documents that were hidden for 70 years, in the testimonies of the few survivors who are still alive, in the work of historians who refuse to let the story be forgotten. The story of the SS Cap Arcona reminds us that war is not just about the famous battles and celebrated victories. It's also about the tragic mistakes, the fog of war decisions that cost innocent lives, the uncomfortable truths that governments sometimes want to bury. It reminds us that even in victory, even when fighting for a just cause against an evil regime, terrible things can happen, and it reminds us of the importance of remembering, of shining light on all aspects of history, even the ones that are painful and difficult. The approximately 7,000 people who died on May 3, 1945, in Lübeck Bay, deserve to be remembered. They survived the Holocaust only to die in the war's final days, killed by the very forces that were coming to liberate them. Their story, hidden for decades, is now part of the historical record. The Cap Arcona, the Queen of the South Atlantic, the pride of Germany, the Nazi Titanic, ended her days as a tomb in the Baltic Sea. Her legacy is a reminder of the costs of war and the importance of truth.